Richard couldn't shake the haunting hope that maybe, just maybe, this young girl was. Welcome to the Trend Reddit channel. Get ready to embark on a journey full of mystery, unexpected twists, and emotional moments. As we dive into this story, you'll uncover hidden secrets within grand halls, witness bonds that transcend time, and feel the power of family and resilience. If you enjoy this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any videos. Thank you for supporting and joining us on this journey. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over the red brick building that had been Valeria's home for as long as she could remember. The orphanage loomed behind her, its familiar structure a blend of comfort and solitude. For 19 years, its walls had sheltered her, each corner etched with memories of laughter, dreams, and sometimes, quiet loneliness. But today marked the end of that chapter. With a deep breath, Valeria clutched the strap of her worn bag, heart thudding with both fear and excitement. "It's finally time," she whispered to herself, her words mingling with the morning breeze as she took her first steps toward an uncertain yet promising future. The cobbled streets felt alive with possibility as Valeria journeyed to the imposing Maxwell mansion, a place that represented a new beginning. She had secured a position as a housemaid for Richard Maxwell, one of the city's most influential real estate magnates. The opportunity had seemed almost too good to be true, and now, standing before the iron gates of the mansion, she felt a wave of apprehension wash over her. The mansion loomed ahead, its grand architecture both mesmerizing and intimidating. Every stone seemed to hold a whisper of the lives lived within, a mystery waiting to unfold. Valeria took a steadying breath, adjusting her grip on her bag. She was here to work, to earn her keep, and perhaps, to find her own place in the world. As the gates swung open, Valeria was greeted by a man who introduced himself as James, the head butler. He was tall and stern, his expression as rigid as his perfectly pressed suit. With a brief nod, he led her into the mansion's grand foyer, where marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers. The elegance of the place was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the simplicity of the orphanage she'd left behind. James's voice, cold and precise, cut through her awe. "Mistakes are unacceptable here," he informed her, his tone laced with a warning. Valeria nodded earnestly, her resolve strengthening despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "I understand, Mr. James." The days that followed were a whirlwind of tasks and expectations, each moment underscored by James's unyielding gaze. He scrutinized her every move, quick to point out any minor flaw, his stern reprimands leaving her feeling as though she were treading on thin ice. Yet, beneath her nerves, a fierce determination took root. She was here to prove herself, to build a life beyond the confines of the orphanage. As each day passed, Valeria found herself growing more accustomed to the mansion's rhythm, her hands moving deftly as she cleaned and organized, her mind focused on excelling. As Valeria settled into her routine at the Maxwell mansion, she quickly realized that the demands of her new role went beyond the simple tasks she had envisioned. Each morning, James, the stern butler, appeared to inspect her work with a meticulous eye. From the way she folded linens to the precision of her dusting, every detail seemed to be a test of her worthiness to remain in the mansion. His presence was as constant as it was intimidating, his gaze filled with an unspoken expectation that she would falter. And though his critiques were sharp and often unforgiving, Valeria remained determined, swallowing her pride and focusing on her duties with newfound vigor. One morning, as she carefully polished the dining room silverware, James appeared at her side, his expression as cold and unyielding as ever. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing to a barely visible smudge on one of the forks. Valeria bit back her frustration, offering a quick nod instead. "I apologize, Mr. James," she murmured, determined not to let his constant supervision undermine her confidence. She took the fork back and polished it again, even more meticulously than before. In her heart, a quiet resilience was building. She was here to succeed, and she wouldn't let his exacting standards defeat her. Despite her resolve, Valeria couldn't help but feel the weight of James's disapproval bearing down on her. She had never encountered anyone quite like him, his words were often harsh, and his criticisms relentless. Yet, beneath his rigid demeanor, Valeria sensed something she couldn't quite place, an undercurrent of tension that suggested he was more than just a demanding overseer. But rather than dwell on it, she channeled her energy into her work, determined to earn his respect through sheer perseverance. As days turned into weeks, Valeria's skills began to sharpen. Her tasks became second nature, her movements more confident. Though James continued to scrutinize her every action, his criticisms grew less frequent, and she felt a subtle shift in his demeanor, as though he was beginning to recognize her efforts. Still, he rarely spoke to her outside of instructions or corrections, and any words of encouragement were conspicuously absent. Valeria accepted this as part of the mansion's atmosphere, a place where warmth and camaraderie seemed to be traded for elegance and order. Her solitude at the mansion was somewhat eased by the beauty of the estate itself, especially the garden, a sprawling oasis of flowers, fountains, and neatly trimmed hedges. It quickly became her refuge, a place she visited in quiet moments, finding solace among the blooming roses and gentle hum of nature. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, she escaped to the garden, breathing in the cool night air as she let herself relax for the first time in hours. In the stillness, memories of her life at the orphanage surfaced, a bittersweet reminder of the past she had left behind. Yet here, surrounded by beauty, she felt a sense of hope blooming within her, a hope that she could make this new life her own. However, her respite was short-lived. The next morning, James resumed his strict supervision, his critical eye sharper than ever. As she scrubbed the grand staircase, he loomed over her, observing her work in silence. The pressure of his presence made her hands shake slightly, and she struggled to maintain her usual composure. Finally, he spoke, his tone as cold as always. "Miss Valeria, in this household, perfection is not a request, it is a requirement," he stated. Valeria nodded, hiding the frustration simmering beneath her calm exterior. "I understand, Mr. James," she replied firmly, determined not to let him see her falter. In the quiet of her thoughts, Valeria wrestled with both exhaustion and determination. She longed to prove herself, to surpass the unyielding standards James imposed on her. His critiques, though relentless, had awakened in her a fierce resolve, a drive to exceed his expectations, no matter how insurmountable they seemed. Each task became a challenge, each day an opportunity to refine her skills and earn her place within the mansion. Over time, Valeria found herself pushing through the barriers of her insecurities. She learned to anticipate James's demands, to carry herself with a calmness she didn't always feel. And as she grew more adept at navigating the mansion's routines, she began to sense a quiet respect building between her and the formidable butler, as though her persistence was gradually chipping away at his stern exterior. Despite the unspoken tension, she clung to a sense of pride in her work, each day inching closer to the respect she so desperately sought. One evening, as she prepared to retire for the night, she caught a rare moment of softness in James's gaze as he observed her finishing up her tasks. It was fleeting, barely perceptible, but enough to stir a quiet satisfaction within her. Perhaps, in time, she could prove herself worthy in his eyes. In the weeks that followed, Valeria gradually found her footing within the Maxwell mansion, adjusting to the rhythm and routines that had once seemed insurmountable. She became skilled in her tasks, anticipating the preferences of the household, and even managing to avoid James's frequent critiques. Each day brought a sense of accomplishment, a small victory in her journey to prove herself. Yet, amidst this newfound comfort, a quiet unease lingered. The mansion was an enigma, its hallways lined with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her as she worked. Every creak of the floorboards, every echo down the corridor, whispered secrets she couldn't quite decipher. Valeria often found herself drawn to the grand garden, her sanctuary, where she would spend stolen moments of peace, letting the scent of roses calm her as she tried to piece together the mansion's mysteries. Her routine took an unexpected turn one morning when Richard Maxwell himself returned from a long business trip. She had heard whispers of him from the other staff, an esteemed real estate mogul, a man of powerful presence but with a reserved, distant demeanor. As Valeria polished silverware in the quiet of the kitchen, she felt a shift in the air, a tension that alerted her to his presence before he even entered the room. Richard stepped in, his gaze cool yet curious as he looked over the kitchen, finally settling on her with a flicker of surprise. Valeria, nervous but composed, continued her work, though she couldn't ignore his piercing gaze. As he observed her, Richard's eyes fell on the heart-shaped pendant she wore, a small, simple necklace that was her only keepsake from her past. His expression changed in an instant, surprise giving way to something deeper, almost as if he were seeing a ghost. Richard's voice wavered slightly as he asked, "Excuse me, that necklace. Where did you get it?" Valeria, taken aback by his intense interest, instinctively touched the pendant, her fingers brushing over the worn silver. "It's all I have from my past," she replied softly, not entirely sure why she felt the need to explain. For a moment, Richard seemed lost in thought, his face unreadable as he struggled to regain his composure. This brief encounter set off a chain of subtle yet significant changes in the mansion. Valeria noticed that Richard's presence became a constant, as though he were drawn to her in some inexplicable way. He often lingered nearby as she worked, watching her with an intensity that left her feeling both curious and slightly unsettled. She began to sense an undercurrent of tension in his gaze, a strange blend of familiarity and distance that she couldn't quite understand. Valeria's thoughts returned again and again to the oddity of that morning, the way his expression had shifted when he saw her necklace, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her connection to this place ran deeper than she had originally thought. As days passed, Richard's curiosity grew, and he subtly inquired about her life, her past, and the orphanage where she'd grown up. His questions, though casual on the surface, seemed driven by a deeper need, as if he were piecing together a puzzle that only he could see. Valeria, sensing the weight behind his inquiries, answered with cautious honesty, sharing what little she knew about her past. She felt a strange sense of vulnerability under his gaze, as though he were searching for something hidden within her, something even she did not know. Meanwhile, James's behavior began to shift as well. The butler, once a figure of stern detachment, grew more observant of her interactions with Richard. His once frequent critiques became tinged with a sense of agitation, and he watched her with a wariness that hadn't been there before. Valeria noticed the way his eyes narrowed when he saw Richard speak to her, as though her newfound proximity to the head of the household disrupted some unspoken balance. Despite his outward calm, James seemed increasingly unsettled, and his gaze held an intensity that bordered on resentment. One quiet afternoon, as Valeria worked in the library, Richard entered, his expression unusually pensive. He sat across from her, studying her with a gravity that made her pulse quicken. "Valeria," he began, his voice hesitant yet steady, "there is something familiar about you, something that I cannot ignore." Valeria felt a chill pass through her, a mixture of intrigue and fear knotting in her stomach. She could sense that he was on the verge of a revelation, something significant that would change everything. "Do you remember anything from before the orphanage?" he asked, his tone both hopeful and apprehensive. Valeria shook her head, her fingers instinctively touching the pendant again. "I was too young," she murmured, a touch of sadness in her voice. Richard's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a flicker of pain in his eyes. "Perhaps," he whispered almost to himself, "perhaps there's more to this than we realize." With that cryptic remark, he rose, leaving her with more questions than answers, her mind racing as she tried to unravel the connection between them. If you find it interesting, please give the channel a like to motivate us to make more new videos. If you find the story not interesting enough, please comment number 1 to help us improve the content. Sincerely thank you. In the days that followed, Valeria found herself entangled in a delicate dance of mystery and discovery. Each encounter with Richard brought her closer to an unspoken truth, while James's behavior grew increasingly erratic, his frustration simmering beneath a veneer of professionalism. The mansion, once merely a place of work, had transformed into a labyrinth of secrets, each corner holding clues to a past she could not remember. Valeria couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of something monumental, a discovery that would reveal the true meaning behind her presence at Maxwell Mansion. As the days pressed on, Richard Maxwell's unease turned into urgency, and he took a decisive step that would shift the entire course of Valeria's life. Unable to ignore the striking resemblance between her and the daughter he had lost so many years ago, he reached out to a private investigator to delve into Valeria's past. It wasn't merely the necklace she wore, a heart-shaped pendant identical to his daughter's, but the haunting familiarity in her eyes, her mannerisms, even her voice. Richard could no longer dismiss the nagging hope that maybe, just maybe, this young woman was the child he had been mourning for years. With each passing day, his anticipation grew, and so did the tension in the mansion, as the hidden truth began to reveal itself piece by piece. The atmosphere in the mansion shifted palpably as Richard's suspicions solidified into action. Valeria felt the weight of his gaze more keenly than ever, and her heart raced whenever he was near. She had begun to sense that something profound linked her to this family, though she didn't dare hope to understand what it could be. She noticed the quiet urgency in Richard's questions, his veiled expressions, and the rare gentleness in his voice whenever he spoke to her. And though she tried to brush off her growing curiosity, a part of her clung to his attention, hoping it would lead to answers that had eluded her since childhood. One evening, Richard's search came to an undeniable crossroad. After scouring records and uncovering fragments of Valeria's history, the private investigator returned with a report that confirmed Richard's deepest suspicions. Valeria had been found abandoned in a city park around the same time his daughter had vanished. The details matched too perfectly to ignore. Overwhelmed by the news, Richard asked for Valeria to meet him in his study, his heart pounding with equal parts hope and fear. As she entered, the room's somber lighting reflected the gravity of the moment. Richard's expression was serious, his eyes a mixture of apprehension and anticipation, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as though steadying himself for the words he was about to speak. "Valeria," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "there's something I need to tell you, something that may change everything." Valeria's pulse quickened, and she clasped her hands nervously, bracing herself for whatever was to come. Richard continued, his gaze never leaving hers, "I believe there is a chance that you might be my daughter." The words hung heavy in the air, sinking into Valeria's heart and leaving her speechless. She felt the ground beneath her shift, her mind racing to comprehend the magnitude of his claim. "Are you saying?" "I have a family," she whispered, her voice trembling as her hand instinctively moved to touch her pendant. Richard nodded, his own voice thick with emotion. "Yes. I can't be certain yet, but I need to know. If there's a chance you are the daughter I lost," he paused, struggling to steady himself. "We can confirm it with a DNA test, but I want you to know that no matter the result, you're not alone here." Valeria's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of joy, disbelief, and hope stirring within her heart. She had spent so long in solitude, her past a mystery and her future uncertain, and now, in a single conversation, she felt the possibility of belonging, of family, of love that she had never known. Their conversation left her both exhilarated and afraid, yet determined to uncover the truth. The DNA test was scheduled without delay, and the following days were a tense waiting game. Richard was an emotional storm, his hope palpable yet tempered by the pain of the years he'd spent grieving. Valeria, too, felt the weight of the impending revelation, her mind running wild with thoughts of what her life might become. But not everyone in the household shared their quiet anticipation. James, the butler who had overseen the mansion for years, seemed to unravel with each passing day. His usual stoic demeanor gave way to fits of irritation, his eyes following Valeria with a dark intensity. She noticed his behavior growing erratic, his glances filled with something she couldn't quite place, resentment, fear, perhaps even jealousy. The closer she drew to Richard, the more James's presence felt like a shadow, a reminder that not all welcomed the potential change in the mansion's dynamic. Then, on the day the test results arrived, Valeria was summoned to the study once again. She entered to find Richard holding an envelope, his hands visibly shaking. The air was thick with unspoken emotion as he opened it, eyes scanning the paper before he finally looked up, his face breaking into a mix of relief and overwhelming joy. "It's true, Valeria," he said, voice choked with tears. "You are my daughter." In that moment, they both dissolved into tears, the past years of longing and uncertainty melting into a single, transformative embrace. For the first time in her life, Valeria felt truly at home, wrapped in her father's arms. But as she reveled in this newfound connection, a cold presence lingered at the edge of the room. James's gaze was fixed on them, his face contorted with an expression Valeria had never seen before, a mix of rage and bitterness. She felt a shiver run through her as he quietly left the room, leaving her with the unsettling realization that not everyone in her new family was ready to welcome her. The mystery was solved, but the true challenges were only beginning. The days following the revelation were a whirlwind of emotion and adjustment for both Valeria and Richard. News of their confirmed connection spread throughout the mansion, and with it, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Richard, overjoyed at finally reuniting with his long-lost daughter, embraced Valeria into his life wholeheartedly. He introduced her to the family's close friends, arranged for her to have her own luxurious room in the mansion, and even planned a celebration dinner to formally welcome her into the Maxwell family. Valeria felt overwhelmed but grateful, her heart swelling with a sense of belonging she had never known. For so long, she had yearned for answers about her past, and now, in the warm embrace of her father, she felt as though the missing pieces of her life were finally falling into place. However, the newfound closeness between Valeria and Richard did not sit well with everyone. James's demeanor grew colder with each passing day, his once subtle resentment now openly manifesting in his behavior. He avoided Valeria whenever possible, his expression darkening whenever he was forced to be in her presence. Once a figure of authority and stability in the mansion, he now seemed out of place, like a shadow lurking at the edges of Valeria's new life. The staff, sensing his simmering anger, whispered among themselves, their loyalty torn between the loyal butler and the new lady of the house. James's bitterness was impossible to ignore, casting a growing tension over what should have been a joyful time for the Maxwell family. Despite the unease, Valeria embraced her new role, immersing herself in the life that was rightfully hers. She explored the mansion and its grounds with fresh eyes, each room, each corridor now holding the promise of family memories waiting to be made. Richard delighted in showing her family heirlooms and telling stories of her mother and grandparents, helping her connect with her heritage. Margot, Richard's wife, welcomed Valeria with open arms, treating her as if she had always been a part of the family. Together, they spent afternoons in the mansion's garden, where Margot would tell her about her own youth, laughing and sharing stories that brought the family closer together. But beneath the surface, a darker truth was waiting to be uncovered. Valeria could no longer ignore the way James's behavior had changed. It was as if the news of her true identity had set off something far more dangerous within him. One evening, as she passed by his quarters, she overheard him speaking on the phone, his voice a low hiss filled with frustration. "This should have never happened," he muttered. "If only she had stayed away." A chill ran down Valeria's spine, and she hurried away, her mind reeling with questions. Why did James seem so agitated by her presence? What was he hiding? Though she wanted to confront him, something held her back, a sense that there was more to his resentment than mere jealousy. Driven by an instinct she couldn't ignore, Valeria began to piece together clues, searching for answers that would reveal the reason behind James's hostility. She sifted through old family documents, photographs, anything that could explain why the trusted butler had turned against her so vehemently. Her search led her to an old journal belonging to Richard, and within its pages, she found an entry that struck her to the core. Richard had written about his suspicion, years ago, that someone close to the family might have been responsible for his daughter's disappearance. He had no proof, only an instinct, but reading it now, Valeria's heart raced as she connected the dots. Confronting Richard with her suspicions, Valeria revealed what she had uncovered. Shocked but determined, Richard demanded answers from James, calling him into the study for a confrontation that had been building for years. The truth spilled out in a bitter confession. Consumed by fear of losing his influence over the Maxwell family, James admitted to orchestrating Valeria's abandonment all those years ago. He had seen her birth as a threat to his position, fearing that she would one day replace him in Richard's favor. In a moment of panic, he had taken the child and left her to be found far from the Maxwell estate, convincing himself that Richard would move on without her. Richard's face contorted with a mixture of grief and rage as he listened to James's confession. All those years he had spent grieving, wondering what had happened to his little girl, only to learn that the betrayal had come from within his own home. "You took my daughter from me, James," he shouted, his voice thick with the pain of betrayal. Valeria watched in stunned silence as her father confronted the man he had once trusted implicitly, her heart aching for the years lost to one man's selfishness. Realizing the depth of his betrayal, Richard vowed to seek justice. He called the authorities, and James was arrested, his years of loyalty and service tainted by the monstrous act he had hidden for so long. The staff watched in shocked silence as the butler was led away, the weight of his betrayal hanging heavily in the air. With James's departure, a sense of peace settled over the mansion. Though the revelation of his betrayal had torn open old wounds, it also brought a cathartic release for both Valeria and Richard. They could now move forward without the shadow of doubt and resentment that had plagued their reunion. The past had finally been confronted, its painful truths laid bare, and the Maxwell family was ready to embrace a future marked by unity and healing. Valeria and Richard, with Margot by their side, committed themselves to rebuilding their family bond, their resolve strengthened by the trials they had overcome together. With James gone and the truth laid bare, the Maxwell mansion felt like a new place, a home no longer haunted by hidden betrayal but filled with the hope of a fresh beginning. Valeria, finally free from the shadows of her lost past, embraced her life as Richard's daughter with newfound joy. She settled into her role within the family, her days filled with the warmth and affection she had yearned for her entire life. The emptiness that had once accompanied her at the orphanage was now replaced by the love and acceptance of a family she had thought she would never have. Richard, Margot, and Valeria formed a tight bond, their shared experiences forging a connection that grew stronger with each passing day. Richard, too, had undergone a profound transformation. The grief he had carried for so many years seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve to make up for the lost time. He and Valeria spent long afternoons in the garden, sharing stories, dreams, and plans for the future. Richard introduced her to his business world, showing her the intricacies of his work, and he was delighted to find that she had a natural aptitude for it. Valeria, ever eager to learn, soaked up every lesson, her confidence growing as she found a sense of purpose in helping her father manage the family estate. The business meetings that had once seemed daunting now felt like opportunities for growth, her father's pride in her a steady encouragement that fueled her ambition. With Margot's warmth and support, Valeria found herself flourishing in other ways, too. Margot treated her as if she had always been her daughter, guiding her through the social circles of the elite and teaching her the finer points of etiquette and grace. Together, they became an inseparable pair, attending charity events, luncheons, and gatherings as mother and daughter, each moment filled with laughter and a genuine bond that softened the memories of Margot's own sorrow over the years of family strife. In Margot, Valeria found not only a mother figure but also a friend, someone she could confide in, whose wisdom and empathy helped her transition into this new life. However, the family knew that true healing required more than just bonding, it needed closure. Determined to put the past fully behind them, Richard initiated a deeper investigation into the events surrounding Valeria's abandonment. He sought out those responsible for failing to protect his daughter and worked to hold them accountable, ensuring that their family's story would be one of resilience and justice. His efforts brought a sense of justice and, in time, a sense of peace that allowed them to close that painful chapter of their lives. Knowing the truth was a bittersweet relief, but it allowed them all to finally move forward unburdened by unanswered questions. To mark their new beginning, Richard proposed a family trip, a way to celebrate the bond they had reclaimed and the future that lay ahead. They chose a destination meaningful to them all, a picturesque village where Richard had spent his own childhood summers and had always dreamed of returning with his family. As they explored the quaint streets and beautiful countryside, Valeria felt her heart swell with gratitude, each moment with her father and Margot a reminder of the life she had been given. Sitting together under the vast sky one evening, Richard made a quiet promise to Valeria. "No matter what the future holds, we're together now. That's all that matters." Their return to the mansion marked a new era, and Richard and Margot wasted no time in welcoming Valeria into the extended family's traditions and responsibilities. In a ceremony held in the mansion's ballroom, Valeria was formally introduced to the family's business partners and close friends, her place in the Maxwell legacy publicly affirmed. It was a proud moment, not only for Valeria but also for Richard, who stood by her side, beaming with pride. The staff, too, treated her with a newfound respect, recognizing her not only as the heir to the Maxwell family but also as someone who had overcome great adversity with strength and dignity. As time passed, Valeria became an active part of the Maxwell family's philanthropic efforts, using her position to support orphanages and community programs that helped young people find purpose and stability. Inspired by her own journey, she wanted to give back to those who, like her, had once felt alone and forgotten. With Richard's guidance, she helped establish a foundation dedicated to providing educational and career opportunities for underprivileged children, a legacy that honored the difficult path she had walked to arrive where she was. In the evenings, the three of them often gathered in the mansion's garden, sharing quiet moments that had become symbols of the peace they had finally found. As they sat under the twinkling stars, laughter would echo across the lawn, a reminder of the strength they had gained from their trials. The garden, once Valeria's solitary retreat, was now a place where they celebrated life, family, and resilience. The Maxwell family had come through their darkest days, emerging stronger and closer than ever. For Valeria, the journey from abandonment to belonging had transformed her in ways she could never have anticipated. She knew that while the mansion had once been filled with secrets, it was now a place of truth, love, and new beginnings. And with her father and Margot by her side, Valeria felt ready to face any future, her heart filled with the promise of a life well lived, a life built on the foundations of family, courage, and the love she had finally found.